Winter, 1942, near Stalingrad. The cold is the first thing I feel every morning. It seeps into my bones, a relentless enemy that I can't fight off, no matter how many layers I wrap around myself. I used to think I was strong, that I could endure anything, but this cold is something else. It's alive, gnawing at my flesh, whispering to me that it'll win in the end. My breath comes out in ragged, frosty puffs as I trudge through the snow, my rifle heavy on my shoulder. The streets of Stalingrad are a graveyard now, twisted metal, crumbling buildings, and the endless white of snow and ash. It's hard to believe this was once a city, filled with life. Now, it's just a tomb. I glance at the men around me. Weber, our sergeant, leads the way, his eyes scanning the ruins for any sign of the Soviets. Dieter, a kid barely old enough to shave, clutches his rifle like it's the only thing keeping him tethered to this world. Maybe it is. We're all hanging by a thread, just trying to survive another day. We find shelter in what's left of a building, the walls still standing, but only just. I huddle against the cold stone, pulling my coat tighter around me, but it's no use. The wind howls through the broken windows, cutting through me like a knife. I try to remember the last time I was warm, but the memory slips away, lost in the haze of hunger and exhaustion. Any sign of the Soviets, Dieter's voice shakes, fear clear in his eyes. Not yet, Weber replies, peering through the shattered window. But they're out there. They're always out there. I close my eyes, trying to block out the world for just a moment. My thoughts drift to home, my mother's kitchen, the smell of fresh bread filling the air. I can almost hear her voice, telling me to sit down, to have a slice while it's still warm. I can see my father's face, stern but proud, as he sent me off to this war with a handshake and a promise. "Come back a hero," he said. I believed him then. Now I can't even imagine going back at all. The crack of distant gunfire pulls me back to reality. The Soviets are on the move again. They never stop, never give us a moment to breathe. I grip my rifle, my fingers numb and stiff. I'm so tired. We're all tired. This war feels endless, and I don't know how much longer we can keep going. The sun dips below the horizon, and the cold deepens. It's like the darkness is swallowing us whole, dragging us further into this hell. We huddle together, trying to share what little warmth we have left. I can hear the others murmuring prayers, desperate pleas that I'm not sure even God can hear out here. "Stay alert," Weber whispers, his eyes scanning the growing darkness. They could be anywhere. I nod, my heart pounding in my chest. The night is the Soviets' ally. They move like shadows, slipping through the ruins, striking without warning. Every sound, every shift in the wind, makes my heart race. My hands are shaking, but I force myself to stay steady. I can't let fear take over, not now. Minutes pass like hours. The tension is unbearable, the silence suffocating. My mind starts to wander, thoughts slipping away into dark places. What if we never leave this place? What if this is where it all ends, in this frozen, God-forsaken city? I shake my head, trying to clear the thoughts away. I can't afford to think like that. I have to focus, have to survive. But it's hard when the cold is all I can feel, when the darkness is pressing in on all sides. I glance at Dieter. His eyes are wide, darting around like a trapped animal's. I want to say something, offer some kind of comfort, but what could I say? There are no words that can make this better, no promises I can make that would mean anything. Weber shifts, the sound of his boots crunching in the snow pulling me back to attention. I raise my rifle, every muscle in my body tensing. The night is too quiet, too still. It feels like something is about to happen, something terrible. The seconds stretch out, each one heavier than the last. I hold my breath, listening, waiting. The cold air burns in my lungs, and the silence is deafening. And then, from the darkness, a single gunshot rings out. The gunshot echoed through the ruins, sharp and clear against the oppressive silence. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then, the night exploded into chaos. "Take cover," Sergeant Weber shouted, his voice barely audible over the sudden hail of bullets. I threw myself to the ground, pressing my body into the snow and dirt, my heart pounding in my chest. The Soviets had found us. The building we had taken shelter in was little more than a crumbling skeleton, offering scant protection from the gunfire that now tore through the air. I could hear the bullets striking the walls, a rapid-fire drumbeat of death. The men around me scrambled for cover, some ducking behind the remnants of walls, others pressing themselves into the ground as I had. There was nowhere to go, no escape from the onslaught. I raised my rifle, my hands shaking as I tried to steady my aim. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, clouding the air in front of me. The darkness was alive with movement, shadowy figures flitting between the ruins, almost invisible against the night. I squeezed the trigger, firing into the blackness. I didn't know if I hit anything. I didn't stop to check. I just kept firing, trying to push back the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. "Hold the line," Weber's voice was hoarse, barely more than a growl. "Don't let them through." I could see him now, crouched behind a shattered wall, his rifle aimed at the enemy. His face was set in a grim mask of determination, but I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear that gripped us all. We were trapped, surrounded on all sides, and the Soviets weren't going to stop until we were all dead. The gunfire was deafening, a constant roar that drowned out everything else. I could hear the screams of the wounded, the desperate shouts of the men around me, but it all blurred together into a single, terrible noise. My world had shrunk to the small patch of ground in front of me, the rifle in my hands, and the cold, unyielding reality of survival. A figure appeared in my sights, a Soviet soldier, his face a pale blur in the darkness. He was moving fast, too fast for me to take careful aim. I fired, the recoil jolting through my body, and saw him stumble. He fell to the ground, his body disappearing into the snow. I didn't have time to think about what I'd done, to process the fact that I had just taken a life. There was no time for anything but the next shot, the next threat. "Dieter, watch your left," I heard Weber shout, his voice cutting through the chaos. I turned just in time to see Dieter, the young soldier, standing frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror. He had seen something that had paralyzed him with fear. I followed his gaze and saw a Soviet soldier charging toward him, bayonet glinting in the dim light. "Dieter, move," I screamed, but he didn't react. He was rooted to the spot, his rifle hanging limply at his side. There was no time to think. I swung my rifle around and fired. The Soviet soldier crumpled to the ground, his momentum carrying him a few more steps before he finally lay still. Dieter snapped out of his trance, his eyes locking onto mine. He looked at me with a mix of shock and gratitude, but there was no time for thanks. The battle was still raging. The Soviets kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. They moved with a grim determination, their attacks relentless. We were barely holding them off, our ammunition running low, our strength sapped by the cold and the fear. Every shot I fired felt like it cost me a piece of my soul, but I couldn't stop. If I stopped, I would die. If I stopped, we would all die. The night dragged on, each minute an eternity. My world had narrowed to the next target, the next breath. I could feel my body weakening, the cold seeping into my bones, but I forced myself to keep going. I had to. There was no other choice. At some point hours, maybe minutes later, the gunfire began to taper off. The Soviets were retreating, pulling back into the darkness. I could hardly believe it. The attack was over, at least for now. "Weber, they're falling back," one of the men shouted, his voice cracking with relief. "Hold your positions," Weber ordered, but I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. We were all at our breaking point, barely hanging on. I lowered my rifle, my hands trembling uncontrollably. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The snow around me was stained dark with blood, some of it from the enemy, some of it from my own comrades. The smell of gunpowder and death hung heavy in the air, mingling with the cold, crisp scent of the winter night. Dieter stumbled over to me, his face pale and drawn. "Oscar, you saved my life," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at him, but I couldn't find the words. My mind was numb, my body running on pure instinct. I nodded, though, trying to convey anything that would make this moment bearable. "We're not out of this yet," Weber said. "Moving among us, checking on the wounded. They'll be back. And we need to be ready." I nodded again, but the thought of another attack made my stomach turn. How much more could we take? How much more could I take? The night was deathly silent now, the only sound the faint moans of the wounded and the soft crunch of boots on snow. I knelt beside one of the fallen men, a comrade whose name I couldn't remember. He was barely alive, his breaths coming in shallow, labored gasps. I pressed my hand to his shoulder, offering what little comfort I could. "Hang in there," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to him or to myself. As I looked out over the battlefield, the bodies strewn across the snow, the dark shapes of the dead and dying, I felt a cold dread settle into my heart. The Soviets would come again, and when they did, I wasn't sure if we would be able to stop them. The first blood had been spilled, but it wouldn't be the last. The days and nights began to blur together, one bleeding into the next like the endless streams of blood that soaked into the frozen ground. The sun, when it appeared, was a pale, lifeless orb in a sky choked with smoke and ash. Time lost all meaning out here. The only markers were the battles, the brief respites in between, and the gnawing hunger that never left us. Weber kept us moving, kept us focused. We couldn't afford to fall apart, not now. The Soviets were relentless, and so we had to be too. But each day, it felt like a little more of my strength slipped away, lost to the cold, to the exhaustion, to the sheer brutality of it all. The war was grinding us down, turning us into something less than human. Rations were running low, just like everything else. A thin, tasteless soup was all we had to keep us going, and even that was getting scarcer. The hunger gnawed at my insides, a constant ache that never let up. I could feel my body wasting away, the fat gone, the muscles soon to follow. But the worst part wasn't the hunger, it was the hopelessness that came with it. The thought of home kept me going. I pictured my mother's face, her smile, the warmth of the kitchen on a winter's day. I thought of my father, of the pride in his eyes when I told him I was joining the army. I wanted to believe that I'd see them again, that this nightmare would end, and I'd walk away from it, back to the life I'd left behind. But with each passing day, that hope grew dimmer, like a candle guttering in the wind. We were posted on the outskirts of the city, near what used to be a factory. The building was nothing more than a hollowed-out shell now, its walls blackened and scarred from countless explosions. It was our base, for now a place to regroup, to plan, and to wait. I sat with Dieter, my back against the cold, hard wall of the factory. He was cleaning his rifle, his movements slow and mechanical, like he was barely aware of what he was doing. His hands shook slightly, the same tremor that had taken hold of all of us. I watched him for a moment, wondering how much more he could take. How much more any of us could take. "You think we'll make it out of this?" Dieter asked suddenly, his voice breaking the heavy silence. I looked at him, unsure of how to answer. The truth was, I didn't know. The odds were stacked against us, and every day felt like it could be our last. But I couldn't tell him that. He needed hope, something to cling to, even if it was a lie. "Of course we will," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We just need to hold out a little longer." Dieter nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He was young, too young to be here, to be facing this. None of us should have been here, but war didn't care about fairness. It took what it wanted and left nothing but death and ruin in its wake. Weber appeared, his face as grim as ever. "Soviets are moving again," he said, his voice low. Scouts spotted them about a mile out, heading this way. I felt a familiar knot of fear tighten in my stomach. Another attack. Another round of blood and bullets and death. I wasn't sure how much more I could take, but there was no choice. We had to keep fighting, keep holding the line, because the alternative was unthinkable. We gathered what little strength we had left and took our positions. The factory offered some cover, but not much. We were spread thin, our numbers dwindling with each skirmish. I could see the exhaustion on everyone's faces, the hollow eyes, the gaunt cheeks. We were shadows of the soldiers we once were, worn down by the endless grind of war. The minutes stretched out, each one heavier than the last. My breath fogged the air in front of me, a reminder of just how cold it was. I shifted my weight, trying to keep the blood flowing to my feet, but they were numb, just like the rest of me. I tried to push the fear aside, to focus on the task at hand, but it was always there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Then, in the distance, I saw them dark shapes moving against the white of the snow. The Soviets were coming, their figures barely visible through the haze of the snowstorm that had begun to pick up. They moved quickly, like shadows, blending into the landscape, making it hard to tell how many there were, but there were always more of them than us. Steady, Weber murmured, his voice a low rumble beside me. Wait until they're closer. I gripped my rifle tighter, my fingers stiff and uncooperative in the cold. The seconds ticked by, each one an eternity. The Soviets drew closer, their figures becoming more distinct. I could see their faces now, grim and determined, just like ours. They were men, just like us, fighting for their lives, for their country. But that didn't matter. All that mattered was survival. Now Weber's shout cut through the silence, and we opened fire. The night erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, the muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness. The Soviets returned fire, bullets whizzing past, some striking the walls of the factory, others finding their mark in flesh. The air was thick with smoke, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling my lungs. I fired again and again, the recoil jolting through me with each shot. I tried not to think about what I was doing, about the lives I was taking. It was them or us, and I had no choice. But with each shot, I felt a little more of myself slip away, lost to the madness of this endless grind. The Soviets kept coming, wave after wave, their determination as relentless as the winter. We were holding them off, but barely. I could feel the line starting to buckle, the pressure too much to bear. Men were falling around me, their cries lost in the din of battle. Dieter was still beside me, his face set in a mask of concentration as he fired into the oncoming horde. But no matter how many we killed, more took their place. The Soviets seemed endless, a tide that couldn't be turned back. The fear was rising in me now, a cold, hard knot in my gut. This was it. This was where we would die. I glanced at Weber, looking for some sign of hope, but his face was grim, his eyes hard. He knew what I knew, we couldn't hold out much longer. But still, we fought on, because there was nothing else to do. Then, through the chaos, I heard the distant roar of engines. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, a trick of the mind. But then I saw them German tanks, rolling across the snow, their cannons blazing. Reinforcements. They had finally come. The sight of those tanks, those iron beasts that could turn the tide, sent a surge of hope through me. We weren't alone. We weren't going to be overrun. Not yet. The tanks opened fire, their shells tearing through the Soviet ranks, sending men and debris flying. The ground shook beneath me, the noise deafening, but I didn't care. The Soviets were falling back, retreating into the night. We had done it. We had survived another day. As the last of the Soviets disappeared into the darkness, I lowered my rifle, my hands trembling with exhaustion. The battlefield was littered with bodies, both Soviet and German, the snow stained red with blood. The air was still thick with the smell of smoke and death, but for the first time in what felt like forever, there was silence. Weber was beside me, his face ashen but alive. "Good work," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. We had held the line, at least for now. Dieter slumped to the ground beside me, his face pale and drawn. "We made it," he whispered, more to himself than to me. I nodded, but the victory felt hollow. We had survived, but at what cost? How many more days like this could we endure? The grind of war was wearing us down, turning us into something less than human. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it claimed us all. As the tanks rumbled past, their engines growling like angry beasts, I felt a cold dread settle into my bones. The Soviets would be back. They would keep coming, and we would keep fighting, until there was nothing left of us. The grind would continue, day after day, until one side was ground into dust. I looked out over the battlefield, at the bodies lying in the snow, and I wondered how much longer I could keep going. How much longer any of us could. But there was no answer. Only the cold, and the snow, and the endless night. The snow fell steadily, a quiet, relentless descent that muffled the world in a thick, white blanket. The battlefield, once a chaotic, blood-soaked arena, now lay still and silent, the dead covered in a shroud of snow. The only sounds were the soft crunch of boots on frozen ground and the occasional murmur of a weary soldier. I sat in the ruins of the factory, my back against a cold, crumbling wall, my rifle resting across my lap. The fighting had subsided for now, the Soviets retreating to regroup, leaving us with a temporary reprieve. But the quiet was unsettling, a stark contrast to the constant roar of battle that had become our normalcy. It was in this eerie stillness that the memories began to surface, unbidden and unwelcome. They came in flashes, images, sounds, smells, moments from the past that I had tried to bury deep within me. But here, in the quiet, with nothing to distract me, they rose to the surface, demanding to be remembered. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the wall, and let the memories wash over me.